When people speak of danger in psychology, they usually imagine pathology, madness, breakdown, or moral collapse. They think of neurosis, psychosis, or the slow corrosion of meaning. Yet the most dangerous sign in psychology is not what is visibly broken, it is what is silently completed. It is the moment when the psyche no longer compensates, no longer protests, no longer dreams in warning symbols, but instead becomes eerily calm, efficient, and convinced of its own clarity. This is the sign that changes everything, because it does not announce itself with pain. It arrives with certainty. You may already sense what I am pointing toward. There comes a moment in a person's inner life when the ego believes it has finally understood itself. The individual says, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in the depths of thought, I know who I am now. At first glance, this appears healthy. Society rewards such declarations. Identity is praised. Clarity is admired. Self-definition is treated as a virtue. Yet psychologically, this moment is often the most perilous crossing a human being can make. For when the ego claims final knowledge of itself, it quietly closes the door to the unconscious. I have seen this pattern countless times in my clinical work. The patient no longer struggles with symptoms in the usual way. The anxiety fades, not because it has been integrated, but because it has been sealed away. The dreams become sparse or repetitive. The imagination dries. Life becomes organized, controlled, strangely flattened. Outwardly, everything may appear successful. Inwardly, a great dialogue has ended. And when the dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious ends, something far older and more powerful than the ego begins to accumulate pressure in the depths. The psyche is not a machine that can be completed. It is a living system of opposites, a tension between what is known and what is unknown, what is lived and what is unlived. The moment one pole declares victory, the other does not disappear. It retreats into shadow, and the shadow, as I have often warned, does not vanish when it is ignored. It becomes autonomous. This is why the most dangerous psychological sign is not chaos, but rigidity, not confusion, but certainty, not suffering, but the absence of meaningful suffering. When a person tells me, I no longer feel conflicted, I listen very carefully. Conflict is not a flaw of the psyche, it is evidence of life. Only dead systems are without tension. In ancient myths, this moment is always marked by hubris. The hero believes he has outwitted fate. The king declares himself invincible. The magician thinks he controls the spirits. In psychological terms, this is ego inflation. The ego, intoxicated by insight or power, identifies itself with an archetypal position. It no longer serves the self, it imagines it has become the self. Let me speak directly to you, because this lecture is not abstract. If you are here, listening inwardly, it is likely because you stand near this threshold, or because you have already crossed it without knowing. Perhaps you have undergone years of suffering, introspection, and inner work. Perhaps you have faced trauma, shadow, loss, or identity collapse, and now there is a strange quiet. You feel done. You feel as though something fundamental has resolved. You may even feel superior to your former self, or impatient with others who still struggle. This is the sign when the psyche truly integrates something, it becomes more humble, not more certain. Integration deepens mystery, it does not eliminate it. When a person truly encounters the self, they do not say, I know. They say, often with trembling, I do not know, but something knows me. In tonight, the danger arises when insight is mistaken for wholeness. Insight is a spark. Wholeness is a lifelong fire that must be tended. When the spark is worshipped as the sun, the psyche hardens around it. The ego builds an identity out of understanding. I am the one who sees. I am the one who has awakened. I am no longer like the others. These thoughts are rarely spoken aloud, but they radiate through behavior, tone, and judgment. At this point, the shadow undergoes a transformation. It no longer contains only personal repressions, but archetypal energy, the unlived life, the rejected vulnerability, the denied dependence, the disowned aggression, all gather behind the mask of certainty. And because the ego believes itself beyond error, the shadow must find other channels. It appears as moralism, as contempt, as sudden, irrational hatred, as projections onto enemies, systems, or imagined threats. History offers us grim demonstrations of this dynamic. Entire nations can enter this psychological state. A collective ego identifies itself with an idea, a destiny, a purity. Dissent becomes evil. Ambivalence becomes weakness. The shadow is projected outward and must be destroyed. What begins as clarity ends as catastrophe. But let us return to the individual psyche, because this is where the real work must be done. How does one recognize this dangerous sign within oneself? Not by analyzing thoughts alone, but by attending to symbols. The unconscious speaks in images long before it speaks in symptoms. When dreams lose their vitality, when they become mechanical or vanish altogether, this is not a sign of health. It often indicates that consciousness has withdrawn its curiosity. The unconscious, no longer welcomed, stops offering its gifts, or it waits, sometimes for years. Another sign appears in relationships. The person becomes less interested in genuine encounter. Others feel predictable, shallow, or irritating. There is a subtle withdrawal of eros, of psychic relatedness. Life becomes about maintaining an internal position rather than entering into dialogue. This is not introversion, it is closure. You may also notice a change in how you experience suffering. Genuine suffering softens the ego. Neurotic suffering loops. But the most dangerous state is when suffering is dismissed altogether. I am beyond this, the person says inwardly, yet what is denied on the surface returns in the body, in fate, in inexplicable disruptions. The psyche has its own ethics. You cannot cheat it by declaring yourself finished. In alchemical symbolism, this stage corresponds to a false gold. The material appears refined, luminous, complete, but it has not yet endured the final fire. True gold does not fear heat. False gold cracks. The unconscious, when ignored, does not remain passive. It becomes destiny. What you refuse to live consciously, you will meet as an external event. This is not punishment, it is compensation. The psyche seeks balance, not comfort. This is why the sign I described changes everything. Because once the ego closes itself to the unconscious, the process of individuation does not stop. It simply changes its method. The dialogue becomes confrontation. The dream becomes accident. The symbol becomes symptom. The archetype, no longer mediated, takes possession. I have worked with individuals who reached extraordinary heights of self-understanding only to collapse later in ways they could not comprehend. I thought I had done the work, they said, and in a sense they had, but they mistook a chapter for the book. The psyche is circular, not linear. What you integrate at one level returns at another, demanding a deeper sacrifice. The self is not reached once and for all. It reveals itself in spirals. If you feel unsettled as you listen to me, this is a good sign. It means the dialogue is still alive. The most dangerous state is not fear, but complacency, not doubt, but final answers. You may ask, then, how one lives without falling into this trap. The answer is not perpetual self-doubt or endless analysis. That too can become a defense. The answer lies in maintaining reverence for the unknown within you, in allowing your inner images to contradict you, in letting dreams wound your certainty, in staying psychologically porous. The ego's task is not to rule the psyche, but to relate to it. Consciousness is a vessel, not a monarch. When it remembers this, the dangerous sign dissolves into a productive tension. The psyche breathes again, and yet, even this understanding can become another certainty if you cling to it. That is why the work never ends, and why I speak to you not as one who has mastered this process, but as one who has been humbled by it again and again. Each time I thought I understood the depths, they opened further. If you are standing at a moment where everything feels settled, resolved, finally clear, I invite you not to panic, but to listen more carefully. Ask yourself not what you have conquered, but what has gone quiet. Ask not what you know, but what no longer speaks to you. Somewhere in that silence, the unconscious is gathering its next symbol, its next demand, its next invitation to descend further into the mystery that you are still becoming. When the psyche enters this silence I have described, it often feels deceptively peaceful. There is a sense of arrival, as though one has reached a plateau after a long ascent. Many mistake this plateau for the summit. Yet psychologically, plateaus are dangerous precisely because nothing seems to demand movement. The ego rests, but the deeper layers do not. Beneath that still surface, currents continue to flow, and when they are not consciously acknowledged, they carve their own subterranean paths. You must understand that the unconscious does not share the ego's concept of time or completion. It does not care that you feel finished, healed, enlightened, or resolved. It cares only about balance, wholeness, and truth. If one-sidedness emerges, no matter how noble or refined it appears, the unconscious responds with compensatory force. This is not malevolence, it is organic necessity. In my early years, I too believed that insight was liberation. I believed that once an image was understood, once a complex was named, its power would dissolve. This is partially true, but dangerously incomplete. Understanding weakens unconscious autonomy, but it does not absolve the ego from relationship. The psyche demands participation, not explanation. The most dangerous individuals I have encountered were not those overwhelmed by neurosis, but those who had built an identity out of their psychological knowledge. They spoke fluently of archetypes, shadow, anima, trauma, yet their lives were brittle. Their relationships lacked warmth, their moral judgments were severe, they no longer listened inwardly, because they believed they already knew what would be said. Here, the archetype of the wise old man becomes distorted. Instead of guidance, it produces dogma. Instead of humility, it produces spiritual pride. The individual unconsciously identifies with the archetype and speaks as though from a higher position, yet has lost contact with their own vulnerability. This is archetypal possession disguised as wisdom. If you have ever felt secretly irritated when others do not see what you see, or impatient with those still entangled in emotional pain, do not dismiss this reaction. It is not proof of clarity, it is often proof of disconnection. True depth increases compassion, not superiority. When compassion dries up, something essential has been sacrificed to certainty. The unconscious then begins to speak in harsher symbols. The dreams may return, but now they are dark, violent, absurd, or grotesque. Figures appear that mock the ego's certainty. The dreamer may find themselves humiliated, chased, exposed, or rendered powerless. These are not regressions, they are corrective movements. In mythology, this stage often appears as the fall of the hero after triumph. Achilles is struck at his heel, Icarus falls from the sky. The king is revealed to be naked. Psychologically, this fall is necessary. It breaks the spell of identification and returns the ego to its proper scale. Yet many resist this descent. They interpret it as failure, depression, or betrayal by the psyche. They attempt to reassert control, to reframe the symbols, to explain them away. But the unconscious does not negotiate with explanations. It requires experience. This is where fate enters. When inner experience is refused, outer events take on symbolic weight. A relationship collapses inexplicably. A career built on identity suddenly loses meaning. The body develops symptoms that defy logic. These are not random misfortunes. They are messages written in the language of necessity. The most dangerous sign, therefore, is not merely inner certainty, but the refusal to suffer symbolically. Suffering, when understood, is not meaningless pain. It is the friction generated when consciousness rubs against truth. To eliminate all suffering is to eliminate all transformation. You live in an age that worships resolution, quick healing, clear labels, finished narratives. This cultural atmosphere makes the danger I describe far more common. People rush toward identity as a refuge from ambiguity. They say, "This is who I am," and close the door. But the psyche is not interested in who you are. It is interested in who you are becoming. The self is not an image you can hold. It is a center of gravity that constantly shifts as new material is integrated. When the ego claims it has reached that center, it has already missed it. If you listen carefully to those who are truly individuated, you will notice something subtle. They speak with conviction, yet leave space. They act decisively, yet remain inwardly flexible. They do not rush to explain themselves. They do not need to convince. There is an inner elasticity that allows contradiction without collapse. Contrast this with the rigidity of those trapped by the dangerous sign. Their words are sharp, their identities are defended. Any challenge feels like an attack. They have answers for everything, except their own restlessness. This restlessness is the unconscious knocking. It may manifest as boredom, cynicism, or a vague sense of futility. Life continues, but something vital is missing. Pleasure loses depth, success feels hollow, the world becomes flat. This is the soul withdrawing its projection. In alchemy, this corresponds to the stage where the work appears complete, yet the material has not yet been reunited with its soul. The substance is refined, but lifeless. The alchemist who stops here produces an impressive corpse. To continue requires a second descent, often deeper than the first. This descent is more frightening because the ego believes it has already paid its price. It feels unfair. Haven't I done enough? The person asks. But the psyche does not operate on fairness. It operates on truth. This second descent often involves confronting qualities the ego finds unacceptable precisely because they contradict the achieved identity. Tenderness in the strong, dependency in the independent, aggression in the compassionate, ignorance in the wise. These opposites demand inclusion, not correction. If they are rejected, they return in shadow form. The compassionate becomes cruel without noticing. The spiritual becomes manipulative. The rational becomes dogmatic. The conscious personality remains intact, but something dark animates it from behind. You may recognize this dynamic in public figures, teachers, leaders, or even therapists who fall spectacularly after long periods of apparent integrity. The fall is not sudden, it is the culmination of years of unacknowledged one-sidedness. The tragedy is not the fall itself, the tragedy is the refusal to learn from it. If you sense that you are approaching or inhabiting this dangerous sign, the remedy is not self-accusation. Guilt only strengthens the ego's fixation. The remedy is curiosity, radical, disciplined curiosity toward what unsettles you. Return to your dreams. Do not interpret them too quickly. Sit with their images. Let them disturb you. Pay attention to what irritates you in others. It often points to what you have exiled in yourself. Notice where your language becomes absolute. Absolutes are psychological warning lights. Above all, allow yourself to not know again. Not knowing is not regression. It is the womb of transformation. The unconscious opens only to those who approach it without armor. The most dangerous sign dissolves the moment dialogue resumes. When the ego says, quietly, perhaps there is more, the psyche exhales, the tension returns, life regains depth, meaning begins to flow again, not as an answer, but as a living question that accompanies you forward. When dialogue resumes, it does not do so gently. The psyche is not sentimental. It responds precisely to the degree of distance that has formed between consciousness and the deeper layers. If the separation has been slight, a dream may suffice. If it has been prolonged, life itself must speak in stronger language. This is why those who pride themselves on strength often meet fate through collapse, while those who value control encounter chaos. The unconscious chooses the exact opposite of the ego's dominant attitude. At this stage, many mistake the return of tension as regression. They say, I thought I had moved beyond this, but nothing is truly beyond until it has been lived on multiple levels. The psyche revisits themes not to torment you, but to deepen them. What was once intellectual must become embodied. What was once symbolic must become ethical. What was once private must become relational. Here we encounter another subtle danger. When the ego reopens to the unconscious, it may attempt to negotiate. It wants growth without cost, transformation without loss. But every genuine psychological movement requires sacrifice. Something you value must be surrendered. Usually, it is the image you have of yourself. The image is precious because it organizes life. It tells you who you are, what you stand for, what you can expect. To let it dissolve feels like death, and psychologically, it is a kind of death, not of the personality, but of its fixation. This is why dreams at this stage often feature funerals, decaying houses, abandoned cities, or dying figures who resemble the dreamer. The ego recoils from these images, yet they are invitations. They announce that a structure which once served you has completed its task. If you resist, the psyche intensifies. The dreams become more insistent, the outer life more obstructive, not because you are being punished, but because the old form can no longer contain the emerging energy. The vessel must crack. This cracking is experienced as meaninglessness. People come to me and say, nothing feels real anymore. They fear insanity, yet this experience is often a threshold. The projections that once animated the world have withdrawn. What remains is a raw encounter with existence. Modern culture calls this depression, and sometimes it is, but not all darkness is pathological. There is a darkness that belongs to gestation. Seeds grow in the earth, not in the light. To prematurely illuminate this darkness with explanations or medication can interrupt a natural process. This does not mean one should glorify suffering or reject help. It means one must distinguish between breakdown and breakthrough. The difference lies in movement. In a breakdown, energy collapses inward and stagnates. In a breakthrough, energy withdraws in order to reorganize at a deeper level. The most dangerous sign, therefore, is not only certainty, but the inability to endure ambiguity. The ego wants conclusions. The self works through paradox. When you can hold two opposites without forcing resolution, you are participating in individuation. At this point, the archetype of the shadow reveals a deeper layer. It is no longer merely personal traits you dislike, it becomes existential. You confront your limits, your mortality, your insignificance. You realize that no amount of insight exempts you from being human. This realization can feel humiliating. It strips away spiritual fantasies and heroic self-concepts. Yet humility is not humiliation. Humility is alignment with reality. It restores proportion. In many religious traditions, this stage is symbolized by the dark night, not because faith is lost, but because images of God collapse. Psychologically, The same applies. Your images of meaning dissolve so that meaning can be experienced directly, without intermediaries. If you survive this stage without fleeing back into certainty, something remarkable happens. A quiet strength emerges that does not depend on identity. You act not to affirm who you are, but because the situation demands it. Your values become lived rather than proclaimed. This is the point at which the dangerous sign fully reverses. The ego no longer seeks to define itself absolutely. It becomes a listening organ. It responds to inner and outer demands with flexibility. Authority arises naturally, without force. Notice the difference between this authority and the earlier certainty. Earlier, certainty was loud, defended, brittle. Now, authority is silent, grounded, adaptable. It does not need to announce itself. It is felt. Relationships also change. You no longer relate from position, but from presence. Others may still misunderstand you, but this no longer threatens your core. Projection diminishes, compassion returns, not as sentiment, but as recognition of shared fragility. Even suffering changes its quality. It is no longer interpreted as a failure of progress, but as part of participation in life. Pain becomes meaningful without becoming romanticized. Joy becomes simpler, less demanding. Yet do not mistake this for an end. The psyche does not offer final stages. It offers rhythms, expansion and contraction, ascent and descent. Each time, the danger returns in new forms. Each time, certainty tempts the ego again. This is why I say the most dangerous sign changes everything. Once you have recognized it, you cannot unsee it. You begin to notice how often certainty masquerades as health, how frequently resolution conceals avoidance. You become wary of inner declarations of completion. This vigilance is not paranoia. It is psychological hygiene. It keeps the channel open between consciousness and the depths. It allows the self to remain alive rather than crystallized into doctrine. If you are listening to me now and feel both unsettled and strangely relieved, this is appropriate. It means the psyche has not closed. Something in you still listens. That listening is more important than any insight I could give you. For in the end, the goal of this work is not to become someone who knows, but someone who can bear not knowing without hardening. The soul does not grow through answers. It grows through encounter, and encounter requires openness, risk, and the courage to remain unfinished. When you reach this capacity to remain unfinished, something essential settles into place without announcing itself. There is no revelation, no dramatic conclusion, no sense of arrival that the ego can seize and turn into a badge. Instead, there is a quiet consent to life as it is, layered, contradictory, unresolved. This consent is not resignation. It is participation without illusion. At this point, the psyche no longer needs to shock you awake. Fate softens. Symbols become subtler. Dreams may grow simpler, yet more precise. A single image can carry what once required an entire myth. You may dream of walking a familiar path, of repairing a small object, of standing beside water without crossing it. These are not signs of stagnation. They are signs of right relationship. You begin to understand something that cannot be taught directly. The unconscious does not want to be conquered, healed, or transcended. It wants to be lived with. It wants recognition, rhythm, respect. When this relationship is restored, the dangerous sign loses its power because the ego no longer seeks to seal itself into certainty. You will still form opinions. You will still act decisively. Individuation does not turn you into a fog of relativism, but your decisions no longer come from a place of self-definition. They come from attunement. You sense what is required rather than what confirms you. This is why true psychological maturity often looks unimpressive to the outside world. It lacks drama. It lacks slogans. It lacks the fervor of conversion or the arrogance of final answers. Yet it carries weight. People feel it without knowing why. They trust it without being persuaded. You may notice that you speak less about yourself, not because you suppress expression, but because self-reference loses urgency. The story of who I am loosens its grip. What matters is what is happening now, what is needed now, what is true now. Paradoxically, this makes you more individuated, not less. You are no longer a concept, you are a presence. The self is not an idea you represent, it is a process you serve. The most dangerous sign, then, has fulfilled its function. It revealed where the ego was tempted to stop listening. It forced confrontation. It demanded humility. Without it, many would remain trapped in perpetual seeking, never risking certainty, but certainty itself had to be encountered and survived. This is an important distinction. The danger was never certainty itself, but identification with it. When certainty passes through you rather than defining you, it becomes wisdom instead of dogma. You will still make mistakes, perhaps more visible ones, because you no longer hide behind explanations. But these mistakes will not fragment you, they will instruct you, they will return you again and again to proportion. There is a profound relief in this. The burden of being right dissolves. The fear of being wrong loses its sting. What remains is responsibility, not as obligation, but as responsibility, the capacity to respond authentically to what life presents. This is why I say the sign changes everything, not because it destroys you, but because it exposes the last refuge of illusion. Once that refuge collapses, you are no longer protected from life, and you no longer need to be. If you ask me what the final mark of psychological health is, I will not give you a definition. I will give you an image. It is the image of a person who can stand at the edge of what they know without rushing forward or retreating backward. Someone who can wait without paralysis, act without arrogance, and suffer without self-betrayal. Such a person is dangerous in the truest sense, not because they dominate or disrupt, but because they cannot be easily manipulated. They are not driven by unmet shadow, unexamined certainty, or borrowed identity. They are inwardly free enough to say yes or no without hatred, attachment, or fear. This freedom is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not seek followers. It does not need to be believed. It simply lives. And if you have listened this far, not with agreement, but with attention, then something in you already knows this terrain. You may forget it again. You may be tempted by certainty again. That is inevitable. But now the sign will speak differently. It will no longer imprison you. It will remind you the psyche does not ask for perfection, it asks for honesty. It asks that you remain in conversation with what exceeds you. When you do this, even danger becomes guidance, and what once threatened to close your life becomes the very force that keeps it open.